Welcome to Eat, Sleep, Wine, Repeat, a podcast for all you wine lovers who, if you're like me, just cannot get enough of the good stuff. I'm Yanina Dore, your host, brand ambassador, wine educator, and sommelier. So stick with me as we dive deeper into this ever-evolving, wonderful world of wine. And wherever you are listening to this, cheers to you. Hello, wine friends, and welcome back to another episode. Now, I am excited to share with you this specific episode, part 1 of 2, with the expert of Burgundy and master of wine, Jasper Morris. Now, if you don't know about Jasper, he built up one of the top importing companies of Burgundian wines into the UK. It was called Morris and Verdon, which eventually then got sold to Berry Bros and Rudd. And he stayed on there as their Burgundy buyer and director until he retired in 2017. Well, he has published 2 editions of his book, Inside Burgundy, which both times has won the Andre Simon Prize. Putting aside his buying shoes, he is now a wine critic, tasting and writing about wine. There really isn't much that Jasper doesn't know about Burgundy over the 4 decades that he has dedicated to this region. So this episode, we will be talking about the quality of Pinot Noir and discussing the styles of this grape variety across the world. Of course, Chardonnay will get a little attention too. We'll be talking about the use of natural yeasts in Burgundy and the changes in Burgundy over the last 40 years, looking at the use of fertilizers and their effects, the technologies that have been adopted, and premox, that's short for premature oxidation. So this was a super frustrating issue that still never really truly got a definite answer as to the cause of why white Burgundies from the mid-90s onwards just oxidized way too early. So I hope you enjoy this episode. Pour yourself a glass of Bourgogne if you can, and let's get stuck in. Jasper, may I thank you for coming on, because you really are a bit of a, can I say, king of Burgundy?
I think Duke of Burgundy, rather than king. We're a duchy here.
Okay, no, Duke. Duke is still fantastic. But I mean, for me, I've always been very scared to do a Burgundy episode on this podcast, because even having done my diploma and trying to understand all of the appellations, what are we? Is it 84 appellations in Burgundy? Is it 84?
Yeah, they keep changing the rules, but I think they've settled on 84 at the moment. It used to be 100 plus, but then they decided to lump a few of them together under one heading.
Well, yeah, whenever you look anywhere, people say more than 80. And I think that's probably the safest thing to say, isn't it? There's more than 80 appellations. And so for me, I'm like, gosh, where does somebody start? And it's so confusing. And you really, having spent 4 decades now understanding Burgundy, I think you are the person that we need to ask. So thank you for coming on to hopefully tackle some questions that I have for you.
Great.
Shall we take it back, though, just so people can understand how you fell into Burgundy? So I believe, am I right, that your love of wine is actually owed to your sister at university?
Yes, well, I mean, I loved wine to drink, but she's the one who pushed me into doing it a little bit more seriously. Okay. Because she was captain of the university wine tasting team, would you believe such a thing exists?
I love that.
Isn't that good? And she was doing her second degree, and I'd started in on my first. She's 4 years older than me, so we sort of overlapped at that point. And she wanted a place in which she could practice with her other teammates of the blind wine tasting, and I was in very conveniently placed, and so she said, could she use my rooms? And I said, oh, all right, but if there's drink going, then I'll join in as well.
Sounds awful. You had to, huh? And so then you obviously start realizing, wow, okay, yeah, the quality of wines. How does that take you to visiting France and then actually importing wine into the UK?
Well, I mean, I knew that I didn't want to do what our family normally do. We've been lawyers for generations, but my father never much enjoyed it. And I was clear I didn't want to do that. And wine had become a real interest outside normal everyday life. outside just sort of going to parties in the evenings or to the pub. It had become something which had sort of clicked intellectually as well as the enjoyment side of it. And I've met a chap who owned a restaurant and an interest in a club in London. He was quite keen to start a wine business. So I said, well, great, let's do it. So I worked in retail in London for about 18 months, which was fascinating because there were some top-end wines in that particular shop that doesn't exist anymore.
Oh, I was going to say, which one?
No,
okay,
but it was called Burley and Goodhouse, of which Mr. Mark Burley owned Annabelle's nightclub.
Okay,
exactly.
That's the connection, right.
And Johnny Goodhouse has started his own company shortly afterwards, which still goes, Goodhouse and Company. And so I just got exposure to some really brilliant wines, almost all French, though not quite exclusively. And after a while, we were ready to go and set up our own business. So that was in February 1981, when I was just 23, so it was a bit frightening. And we decided that we wanted to do French wines, initially at any rate. And off I went in my trusty old second-hand Citroën and drove around France in that first year. And loved lots of parts of France, and the Loire, the Rhone, all over the place. There was nothing we could really do in Bordeaux because it was already so well covered by companies with much more finance available in the UK. But Burgundy wasn't being very well handled in general.
Why was that?
Well, because for the longest time, almost everything that got exported from Burgundy was from one of the big merchant companies who had probably got a bit complacent. Or if you're at the cheaper end, it might be from Mâconnais or Chablis, it would be a cooperative. But nobody had really much cottoned on to the idea of small domains, of owner-operator winemakers. And I met this extraordinary woman, Becky Wasserman, truly terrific person. And like so many others, sort of fell under her spell, if you like, and really got to understand what it was all about. And I mean, she had a business. The business continues now without her. But she had this business of selling to overseas markets, particularly the USA, but others too, the wines from these small producers. And she has been invaluable as a help to people like me, originally importers, to journalists, critics, and indeed to the producers themselves. So I was fortunate to meet her on my first trip in December 1981, and I've never sort of really looked back. And she introduced me to all sorts of growers in Burgundy who had such a passion for what they were doing. It wasn't a question of the commerce, how much wine do you want to buy? And they weren't just sort of rural farmers who happened to be working with grapes rather than another crop, but there were people who were just totally dedicated to what they were doing and fascinated by the difference between the same grape in different vineyard sites. And so I really cottoned on to that.
I love it. So why is it that Burgundy was so alluring for you when you think that you went to Loire, and that's quite, again, a bit more rural compared to, say, Bordeaux? Why Burgundy? Well,
Burgundy has got a sort of a dynamic centre to itself. I mean, it doesn't feel like provincial France. The energy and the amount of sort of intelligence in the region, it is a thriving place, and it sort of sometimes feels of itself. That's why I mentioned Duke to begin with, because Burgundy tried to make itself into a kingdom in its own right back in the 15th century and prior to that, and it never quite worked. Then France took over, but Burgundians do almost think of themselves as more Burgundians than French sometimes. So it has got its own dynamic energy, and it turns out it's one of the parts of France that can make truly great wine. And whenever you get that stimulus, then you do draw interesting people into the region.
And I mean, at the end of the day, we all know that this is the place for the Holy Grail. Everybody is searching for that best Pinot, or around the world, people are trying to emulate that best Pinot. You must have had some very magical experiences tasting some very special wines throughout your travels. Do you care to share a few and paint a picture? And we can all close our eyes whilst you describe.
Okay, well, yes. I mean, this idea,
how can you find one or two experiences? Yeah.
I'm going to come to it indirectly, really.
Okay.
And it'll turn up, I think, at the right point as we go through.
Well, let's hope so.
But I just want to address a couple of the slight cliches about Burgundy, which tends to get He says cruelly, you've used one of them so far in the
Holy
expression
Grail.
Holy Grail, exactly. And the other is Burgundy as a minefield. So yes, it's true that Burgundy used to be exceptionally inconsistent, and it still is more variable bottle to bottle than, say, a good Bordeaux would be. But the Holy Grail, yeah, it is something that catches the imagination. And I think we need to talk about the Pinot Noir grape, because it's Pinot that's done this rather than the whites.
Mm-hmm.
We know that the whites are wonderful. They've been established as probably, well, certainly France's premium white wine area since forever. But nonetheless, there isn't quite the same allure about white Burgundy internationally, because you can make great Chardonnay in virtually every country. But Pinot is more difficult. And I think the secret to this is the nature of the grape itself physically, because it has a very thin skin compared to the other top red grapes. So it gets sunburned very easily. And like thin-skinned people, it can be sulky as well. But it means that all what we consider the really established New World countries, let's say California, to count that as a country, Australia and so on, they all, when they started getting into the modern era of winemaking, and places like the Napa Valley or the Hunter Valley started to get some fame, Pinot was one of the grapes they planted, and then discovered it doesn't really work because the climate wasn't right, possibly not the soil either, but certainly not the climate. And so Pinot since then has disappeared off to different parts of California, Oregon, New Zealand, different parts of Australia, etc., etc. But the first places that got planted up didn't quite work. So in Burgundy, you've got this really elusive quality about Pinot. It's a grape which is really based around the balance between the fruit of the Pinot Noir and acidity, whereas we tend to talk about most red wines in terms of their tannic structure. And sure, tannins exist and are important, particularly if they're out of balance, but it's much more a fruit-acid balance. And the thing that makes Pinot so magical, I think, is the nature of the aroma, which again is a little bit elusive. It's not like, it's something where someone goes by and you think, gosh, that person's beautiful, but it's not seeing them front on. It's just out of the corner of your eye, and you turn your head and try and catch it, and it's probably moved on already. So that I think is part of it, and the beauty of the aftertaste as well. Sure, the wine is delicious all the way through, but it's the front end and the back end which I think are particularly magical about Pinot. And it is that little bit less consistent, shall we say. But I also think there has been a change in the zeitgeist of how people appreciate wine. So if you go back to the time that I started, then you would drink wine casually for pleasure, but also you might use it on a more formal occasion, that if you were entertaining maybe your boss at work or future in-laws or something like that, then you needed to have wine which had status, was going to taste good, and you could be sure of. And Bordeaux does those things much better than Burgundy does. And that seemed to be important then. But now it's the journey which excites people. And I'm sure you found that when you were doing your diploma studies, as well as the work that you had to do for the exam, but you would meet up with groups of friends doing it as well. And you just have a whale of a time trying all sorts of different wines and being fascinated by the experience you got out of them. And Burgundy offers that. Even if you've already drunk several other bottles, if you were lucky enough to buy a case of a wine, each new bottle is going to give you a slightly different experience. And it's the fun of finding that out at the moment in people's minds is trumping the fact that you haven't quite got the same consistency where every bottle is guaranteed to reach the same standard.
So have you found then that your tasting experiences of Pinot, that's what, again, has given you more of the allure that every single bottle is different? That every Pinot, you're searching for the next Pinot that maybe trumps that Pinot, that offers something slightly different angle?
Yeah, yes. I mean, there's still, nonetheless, if we take the case of, there used to be cases of 12, but in the good old days.
The good old days, at least it's 6, is slightly more affordable now.
The thing was, the 12 was a lot cheaper then than the 6 is today. So
I'm going to ask you in a bit, the changes across Burgundy, but
let's come on to pricing, because we don't want to get too depressed too quickly in this.
No, we need to get back to the beautiful memories. Well, let me tell you one of my memories, and you can tell me what you think. So I am not as fortunate as you to have drunk as much high-end Burgundy, but during my days as a sommelier, I had a moment where, we had a wine list that had wines up to £6,000. It was a premium restaurant in London. And a customer asked for a Comte Georges de Vogue, a Moussigny, the Grand Cru Moussigny. I may have mentioned this on the podcast before, but basically I showed them the wine, brought it back to the station to obviously decant it and taste it, make sure it was okay. I'm quite busy at this point, so I give it a quick little lick and I'm like, oh, lovely, great. I remember lovely, pure, clean fruit. Great. Okay. And I go and serve the bottle and then I carry on doing my job and I think nothing more of this Moussigny. And then 5 minutes later, boom, there was this explosion in my mouth that I have never had with any other wine in my life and never have till this point, in fact. And I was like, where has this flavor come from? This absolute, it was like a ballerina ninja. It literally was dancing around my mouth. Yet,
yes.
I'm sure you understand, which is why I'm asking you was there a moment when you went, oh my God? Or when you think about the first times you were tasting some Grand Cru Burgundies?
Yes, but you've hit on it. It follows up what I said earlier on about the back end. It's the aftertaste, which can be so magical in these wines. And you're right that there can be a delayed reaction to the enjoyment, but it then stays with you. And sometimes the following morning you wake up and you can still taste it in your mouth, which is just wonderful.
God. Okay, I need to drink more Burgundy.
Yes, we have to go back and get a really well-paid restaurant job, which probably doesn't exist, but still.
That's one of the things I miss about being a sommelier, because there was that access to, tasting other people's wines on a daily basis. So let's go back to Pinot Noir then, as the great variety that is. You're going to hate me because I want to take you to a cliche, as in the Burgundy style.
Doesn't exist. Doesn't exist.
Well, and I think that's still important to say.
It's very important, and I hear it so often when I'm obviously not since COVID, but I used to go Oregon, California, and a lot to New Zealand in particular. And time and again, people would say, as they're showing me their Pinots that they're making in their part of the world, I make mine in a Burgundy style. And it just doesn't work that way. Just occasionally, I feel tempted to turn it on its head. And someone asks me about the style of a particular Burgundian producer. And I say, well, it's a slightly new world style. But I shouldn't really do that, given that I don't like the concept of Burgundy style. So I suppose it's about sweet fruit on the one hand. It might be the more the New World side, and a more of a savoury approach. And it's why it's incredibly difficult to do blind tastings which mean anything between wines from different parts of the globe. Because if I'm sitting in Burgundy and we put together a tasting in which there are 12 wines, of which 6 are Burgundies and 6 are from the different parts of the New World, there is a sweetness of the fruit and a rather simple aspect comes across from the New World wines. And if I'm doing the same tasting in New Zealand or San Francisco or somewhere, then the Burgundy wines seem difficult, dull, ugly, less clean, alongside these beautiful, pure New World Pinots. So the idiom is too different, really. And it's also true to say, if I know, I don't know, several hundred, we'll call it 1,000 different Burgundy producers, then there are at least 2,000 Burgundy styles from those 1,000 producers. What is great, though, it is worth saying, is that Burgundy has never fallen into the trap of everybody trying to follow the same guru, make their wines in the same direction, which you could perhaps accuse Bordeaux of in the heyday of Robert Parker and consultants like Michel Roland and so on and so forth. There really was a big movement, not quite everybody, but a big movement to make the wines that followed that particular style. In Burgundy, you'll get a group of people who head in one direction, but you'll then get another group who go off in a totally different direction. And that makes it endlessly fascinating. As a wine critic, I'm not trying just to say these are the wines that please me most. I'm trying to understand what the producer wants to do and then say, has he been successful in the style that he wants to make? He or she, I should say. Because happily, we're getting many, many, many more female wine producers. So now it's as likely to be the daughter as the son taking over, which is great.
Yeah, adding a different touch. I just want, because I've been asked by several people in the last few months to do a Pinot Noir episode, which I might do in the future, but I have you here at the, just at the end of the microphone. Would you say, I mean, I know you've already actually kind of touched on that almost maybe cleaner, brighter, sweeter fruit from the New World. What I've often found, and again, we shouldn't really be saying New World, Old World, but it's just for people to understand that often when I taste a wine from, say, Oregon or Chile or Central Otago, the fruits can often be, obviously, very often bolder, but more of the red cherries, the red berries, whereas then if I go to a wine from Burgundy, it might be more red currants, cranberries, sour. Now, obviously, they can mix the two, and that's the beauty of tasting Pinots from amazing plots. But that's sometimes how I differentiate the style. I would also say to people, perhaps a Pinot Noir that has a more Burgundian style, you're going to tell me off, is more savoury, would get more of the truffle notes and more of the mushrooms and autumnal leaves rather than just fruit. Just what do you have to say about that?
Okay. Well, on that last point, it's sounding to me as though, I mean, those descriptors are much more typical of an old wine, and you probably have more ease of access to slightly more mature Burgundies than you do of the New World wines, where typically it's the current vintage that's on sale. I buy some and keep them and try them years later as well. But nonetheless, normally, if you're looking around to try and get supply in London, then it's going to be a young vintage. Look, I talk about ripeness often in the colour terms of the fruit. So we can agree that a green wine is underripe. Yeah. I'm interested in the whole range of the red fruit profile. And then you have black fruits. And Robert Parker, for example, I think required a certain level of black fruit for him to feel that the wine was ripe. And for me, that can be falling into over-ripeness. But then if we go back to in the middle, the red fruit, and I'm thrilled if there's a little thread of green in it or a little thread of black in it, I think those are the most complex wines. And any wine that you can actually just use a single fruit to describe it, then you're wasting your money spending upwards of 10, 20, 30 pounds on a bottle of wine if you could go out and buy a punnet of strawberries. But nonetheless, if you talk about cranberry, red currant, sort of fresh red cherries, then that is the less ripe end of the scale. And it's up to your own palate whether you find a thrill in those or whether you need a bit more ripeness. Then as you start to go into darker cherries or plums or raspberries, then you tend to be getting towards a more classical ripeness. And if it gets into dark plums and definitely black cherries, then you're beginning to get fully ripe or possibly overripe, depending on where your palate is. I sometimes use the expression alpine strawberries, those little fraise des bois in French, when there's a wine that particularly pleases me, because it's not just about the fruit, but it's bringing to me an image of something which is really detailed and elegant and fine. And that's often a descriptor that comes into my favourite Burgundies, I must admit.
Well, fine-boned is often a descriptor as well for very good.
I love to use that. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's move across quickly to Chardonnay, because bless Chardonnay, it deserves a little bit of attention as well. From you having tasted so much Chardonnay across the region, how would you talk about that to people who have no idea what to expect?
Yes, our problem is that we've taken Chardonnay for granted, and it's almost become synonymous with white wine, to the extent that an American importer who was selling German wines and was really struggling. He had a small sort of cult following, but in the greater public, it just wasn't working at all. And people would come up to his stand at a tasting when he had all these sort of German and Alsace bottles, and they'd say, "Can I taste your Chardonnay?" And instead of saying, "Sorry, we haven't got any Chardonnay, do you want to try this Riesling?" when people would turn away, he said, "I've got some wonderful ones. Now, try this wine. Don't you love it?" And the important thing is, whenever you want to drink a really good Chardonnay, make sure it comes from this place called Riesling, and it has Riesling on the label, and then you'll get the best results. But Chardonnay is a chameleon because you can grow it anywhere in the world. I sometimes suspect it's taken its name from a chardon in French, is a thistle, and sort of Chardonnay is like a weed that pops up absolutely everywhere. No, good weed. Nice weed.
Some weeds can be pretty.
Exactly, yeah. So you can actually make it at fairly low alcohol at sort of 11.5, 12 degrees and maybe no oak, and it's absolutely beautiful in a crisp style. Or it works in California and Australia at 15%. And normally I really don't enjoy wines at that level of alcohol, but you can with Chardonnay. And then oak sits well with that much richer style. And it's a gorgeous, sumptuous, incredibly long-lasting wine from almost anywhere in the world. But what it doesn't have is its own natural flavour profile. So we talk of Sauvignon, you've got gooseberries. We talk of Gewürztraminer, and you've got lychees. And this grape has this, and another grape has that. But Chardonnay is quite neutral. It's about being full-bodied more than it is about having a flavour profile. And then you can get the flavour through your winemaking. You can get it through the oak. You can get it through the fact there's more sunshine or less sunshine. The aromatics only really come when the wine is quite mature. So if you pop a young one that you just bought in the supermarket, if it is very aromatic, it's probably the style of the winemaking, possibly the yeasts that were used, that can give it. If you get tropical fruits, it's often something that's been induced rather than a natural birth. Yeah,
interesting. Actually, I know I've started getting into yeast and understanding how you can use one to dial up the thiols or add texture. I think it's fascinating. That's a whole.
I mean, here in Burgundy, most people don't. They work with
natural, the indigenous yeasts, normally.
Even there's a debate because are the natural yeasts sitting on the grapes out there in the vineyards? Yes, but probably what actually ferments your wine is the population of yeast that's kicking around in the cellar. And that's the one that dominates.
Interesting that in Burgundy, though, they are still using the indigenous yeast, regardless of, where is the main population of that yeast. I'm surprised still that more of the maybe younger generation haven't gone on to trying packaged yeasts for experimenting with that.
In fact, it's more a case of people coming back to natural yeasts. Because there would have been a period, 70s, 80s, when people would have been more likely to use the packaged yeasts, and then they discovered that they're making far more interesting wine without. And it's also about one of the reasons you might want to use the cultured yeasts is because you aren't sure that you're going to be able to ferment your wine safely and cleanly. The last thing you want is for a stuck fermentation, because then you get all sorts of horrible things happening. Now, if you're starting up in a part of the new world where the wine industry is only really getting going, you haven't got this massive population of yeasts all around, and you probably don't want to take risks, and that I can fully understand.
Yeah.
Here in Burgundy, people know they're going to ferment through.
Because they've been doing it for years.
They've been doing it for years. It's true that in these much hotter, drier years, with higher sugar levels, then there is more of a risk. And nowadays, people will probably have, the option of a cultured yeast on hand. As soon as they can see that the natural yeasts are beginning to look a bit feeble and not quite doing it, then they'll intervene. And I think that makes sense too.
Okay. Now, interesting, you said that people have come back to natural yeasts if ever they were using a cultured yeast. Let's talk about those 4 decades that you have been tasting Burgundian wine and visiting Burgundy. How has things changed? We could talk about pricing first, shall we?
No, we'll talk about pricing last because it's linked to the quality changes, and it's also linked to technology and ability to communicate. So if we start, so it's still pretty old fashioned. When I first came out, 1981, then it really was a question of going to see not just the big 4, but there were more than that, but a group of the major merchants. And as I say, I was lucky enough to be introduced to all these exciting producers. The domain bottling idea existed really from the 20s and 30s, but was very small. You might have a couple of famous names in any given village, but not much more than that. And now, each year I go and taste with 40 or 50 different people in the village of Meursault, and I'm aware there's another 10 or 20 who might be equally good. I just haven't had time to. So that's one village, and we're already talking about 40 or 50 of them. It's extraordinary. So at that point, when I came onto it, Burgundy was actually at a very low ebb, because during the 70s, we had really had the technological advances, which turned out to be the opposite of advances, of using loads and loads of chemical fertilizer and loads and loads of weed killers, and every other form of pesticide, herbicide, insecticide, etc. Which did seem, in viticulture as in other industries, it seemed to be an obvious step forward, and only a very few people resisted. And you can understand why. It did seem to be, but what happened was that the things that you're putting into the vineyard, particularly the fertilizers, were unbalancing the the acid balance of the vineyards, which then transfers through to the grapes, which means you're getting grapes with much lower acidity, which means that you are a much higher risk of bacterial spoilage. And it's probably, I'm sure it's true also that all these things were stripping out the potential for the most interesting flavors. So obviously you try something like that and it takes a while before it's really clear that you've made a full step. And that became recognized in the 1980s. Okay. And at this same time, the generation of growers of my age, who are all just sort of beginning to hand over to their kids now, it was the first time that you had a whole generation of people who had been to wine school, who tasted in each other's cellars, who were starting a drive towards a much more consistent quality. And that has really developed beautifully since. So the 80s was the beginning of the turnaround. 1985 was a beautiful vintage that, for the first time, I heard this expression, if you want to make a bad wine in 1985, you have to do it deliberately. Well, unfortunately, I must assume what I've tasted since, that a few people did do it deliberately. But actually, it was a very good and relatively consistent vintage.
Yeah, okay.
Then in the 90s, it really did begin to show. And now people are starting to plough their vineyards. And though we're beginning to move on even from that, people began to get sorting tables, which means that as your grapes come into the winery, you let them travel across this little conveyor belt and you have people on either side and you throw out any grapes which are substandard, either because they've got some aspect of rot or because you can see they're underripe. Now, in the earlier period, still even into the 80s, almost nobody did this. You just accepted, this is what the vintage is like this year, and you shoved everything into your fermenting vat, and if there was rot, if there was volatile acidity or something, well, that was too bad. That was just the nature of the year. By 2000, that is really changing. And almost all the good domains have got good sorting tables by then. And then through the rest of the 2000s, steadily, most of the improvements genuinely do seem to me to be improvements. They get exaggerated. People start using a bit too much new oak. Well, they backed off that. Okay. Some people, there are trends which can be stylistic. Some people now use a lot more of the whole bunches, i.e. they don't take the grapes off the stems.
Yes, this is a big conversation right now.
It's a big conversation.
Isn't it? Whole bunch, or do you use stems and how that adds
or a
structure.
mixture of the two. Some are all one way every year, and some vary according to the year or according to the vineyard. It's fascinating, but we would need hours for that. So let's just table it. A lot of people have gone organic and indeed biodynamic, and that's happening more and more. And now it's often it requires the generation to change. But as soon as the son or daughter comes into place, then they start converting to they may already have been organic, but they start getting certified. And that's quite important. And in certain countries, if you want to get your wine listed in the Norwegian state monopoly, for a lot of appellations, they insist that you be certified organic before they'll even look at a sample. And I think maybe the Canadian monopolies may be doing the same thing. So it is becoming much more standard now, which is great. And people are beginning to move away from ploughing, even though it was so much the right thing to do during the 80s, 90s, 2000s. Because now they're moving more towards a type of no-till farming because they think that disturbs the soil less, keeps the humidity in the soil better, and so on and so forth. So as always, what was the absolute standard of one generation gets questioned by the next. And what I do think is good, speaking particularly of the red wines, is that if we take 1985 as the kickoff point of Burgundy getting really good, we're now coming up for 40 years later, and there is no sign of complacency. It's just being driven further and further. There was, however, a blip in the whites, because there was a period when, and it comes back to Chardonnay being almost sort of too easy and us taking it for granted and people not asking questions enough. And though it would seem natural when things go wrong to blame the producers first, But I also think we should blame the importers, including myself at that time, and the wine critics, including myself now, because we weren't questioning it until things started to go wrong. And the thing that went wrong was the wine started oxidizing in bottle long before they should have reached their sell-by date. Mm-hmm. And you can date that back to the 1996 vintage. And it's weird that everything fell off a cliff quite so quickly. And again, it's a subject we could talk about for hours, so I won't go into it in too much detail.
Yeah, for everyone, the conclusion, we still don't know exactly why that happened, right?
We still don't know exactly why that happened, but clearly you can stop it happening in terms of improving the closures on your bottles, which is why a lot of people have gone away from natural cork. And it is true that in 1996, that was a year when the cork industry did change quite dramatically their treatments for the corks. So that clearly is one factor. There are loads of others, and including the fact that the grapes are riper now, and I think are more susceptible to that because of the additional ripeness.
Just question on natural cork, because I had a conversation with a wine lover who got very confused about diam cork and natural cork and stuff. So, and they were like, "Oh, well, that's cork," and I was explaining. So, presumably, because I imagine very few producers in Burgundy are going to screw cap, are they pretty much using diam cork? Is that
yes? Diam is a trademark, and there are other suppliers as well as them, but it's become a slang like Hoover being used for a cleaner or whatever. Yeah. That dates me probably. Plimsolls one could even go to, but we won't. Anyway, so back on the diam. It's a brand, and what they do is they take the natural cork, they deconstitute it, they clean it up totally, and they then reconstitute it. And I find them aesthetically unpleasing.
They're very annoying to get back in the bottle, aren't they?
Well, you just got to drink the whole bottle, Janina. Shape up.
Okay, yes. Yeah,
but it's true. No, I agree with you.
And they're not so good for Coravan either.
So far I haven't gone down that route either. No, I mean, normally if we don't finish a bottle, then I just shove a stopper back in the top. In fact, normally a glass stopper these days, and put it in the fridge overnight and drink the rest of it the following night. And it doesn't seem to do it any harm.
But yes, but at least with diam, I always say this when I speak to winemakers, they've spent you've got one harvest, you only get to make your wines once a year, and then you put in a natural cork that could actually, obviously now natural corks are, the qualities are getting so good now, but, you then want to, potentially a winemaker wants to risk it, and then people get to have and the worst thing is, of course, if you get a slightly corked bottle and a consumer doesn't actually realise and just thinks, oh, that's a bit overly oaked, it's a bit woody, when actually,
in fact, it's the cork. That's right.
Yeah,
and I mean, every time you have this, could be in a restaurant, could be at home, and you're thinking, is it corked? I'm not sure. Someone says they're thinking it is, someone else says not. You get out another bottle of the same wine, and there's a clear difference. So even those fractional ones, they have removed some of the quality. But you're right, the corks are a lot better, and a lot of people now are moving to waxing instead of using capsules, which I think there is a generation of wax which is a lot more interesting now than used to be the case when you as a sommelier, if you had a wax, you would hate it because you get wax all over the tablecloth.
Well, the quality wasn't... some waxes were a lot better, and you could take the whole thing off in one, but the majority, created an absolute... state all over the table.
The best way to go is to have a long neck in your bottle where you sink the cork just a little bit below the top of the glass, and you then have a little sort of pin cushion of a wax on top of that.
Yes,
and then the modern waxes, you just put the corkscrew straight through the wax, through the cork, pull it out, no problem.
Yes,
so that to me is probably the ideal. And since with supply issues, it's been really hard to get hold of capsules, amongst other things. I think we're going, excess packaging. I think we're going to move away from seeing capsules on an awful lot of bottles.
Well, capsules were designed, weren't they, back in the day, so that when a winemaker didn't actually fill the bottle completely to the top, you couldn't tell, right? That's what I've heard.
I have heard that, but I don't actually think that is the that is the case. I think that.
No?
Indeed. No, I don't think that is true. Wow. But I mean, it's quite a nice theory. But
never let the truth get in the way of a good story.
Exactly. Yeah.
So now, when you started in Burgundy, I've spoken to people that 40 years ago, they were students, and even though it might require putting aside a little bit of money, they could afford Grand Cru Burgundy. And now it's just like, oh my God, it's insane.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes, pricing has gone up.
Absolutely. It was totally possible. And your sort of village Burgundy might cost just under or around £10. Your Premier Cru would be around 20, and the Grand Cru could be 35 to 40. I still have some Grand Crus from great producers whose wine nowadays is into the thousands per bottle, but I bought them, 35 years ago. And as far as I'm concerned, wine costs what I pay for it and not what I could sell it for. So I keep those and very occasionally dip into one.
I was born in the wrong generation. I could be rich right now if I bought all those Burgundies 40 years ago. Anyway, wine is for drinking.
Exactly.
I must remember that. Now, let's talk about your book, because 2020, where are we now? 2023 now. But just 2 years ago, you released the second edition of Inside Burgundy. So the first one came out 10 years before.
That's right, yeah.
So do you touch on a lot more of maybe the innovation? What's the differences between those two books? Because, of course, I think people think that Burgundy is quite static. And I think from listening to what you've said in the past, it really isn't.
No, it's not. Okay, so the first idea of writing the book anyway, because I wrote it before thinking about getting it published, because I wanted to do it my way. Whereas if you went to a publisher, they'd say, yes, book on Burgundy. Either we don't need one, or if we do need one, do it this way, because that's how wine books are done. But I took a different approach. Instead of talking about all the producers, though of course they do get talked about, I focused on all the vineyard sites. Because that's what makes Burgundy so different, is that you've got, again, the numbers vary slightly, but let's say 38 Grand Crus, 600 and something Premier Crus, and then a host of other individual vineyard sites which don't get classified as a Grand or Premier Cru. And it really interests me. And so under each village, I wrote about all the Grand Crus in detail, all the Premier Crus in a fair amount of detail, and some of the other village wines. And of course, they don't change that much. Our appreciation of them can change as we learn more about them. But these are vineyards which some of them have been in production for more than 1,000 years. And broadly speaking, the underlying geology certainly hasn't changed, even if what's going on top of the surface has. So that didn't change too much. But I've learned a lot more about it. I've met a lot more wine producers. And so I was able to renew everything on the producer side. Plus, of course, things like how to grow your grapes, the climate, vintage characters and all that. That's changed enormously in the first decade of sort of real global warming, if you like. So obviously we've been seeing it. You can start tracing it back. If you look at harvest dates and ripenesses of grapes, you can start tracing it back to maybe 1990, but it's really accelerated since 2003 and particularly since 2018. So I did have quite a lot to rewrite. And it doesn't really work just to dive in and change a sentence here and there. You've got to do it properly. So it was a very fully revised edition.
And congratulations, because, of course, this was the award-winning book, the Andre Simon Awards. So,
yes, we won that for the first edition and the second edition, which is unique, because that's never happened before. So, sorry, apologies for boasting. But
the amount of information in there and the amount of energy you've had to put in there. So, no, that's amazing. So, everybody go and get it. If you're in the UK, you can buy this through Berry Bros and Rudd, which, of course, you passed over.
I used to work with them. That's right, yeah.
Absolutely, importing company to them.
If you're listening anywhere else, you can find out on my website, which is the same name as the book, so www.insideburgundy.com. That will lead you to a stockist in your part of the world.
Yeah, and there was plenty of them, isn't there? But, I was looking at the Berry Bros and Rudd website. It's out of stock at the moment, or at least I don't know if they've changed it, but you used to be able to buy the book, which I thought this is an amazing birthday gift for anybody. It's the book with 4 bottles of Burgundy, and that, at the moment online, says it's out of stock.
That might have been a sort of a Christmas pack they put together.
Oh, they need to do it again.
For the book itself, you should be able to.
Yes, no, the book is there.
You should be able to find it, yeah.
Yeah, go and tell them what an amazing birthday gift for anybody who's a real wine lover to get your book and then 4 Burgundies. I think that's a really clever gift. So I saw that and I thought, I'll
probably see them next week.
Yeah,
coming to London, and I'll mention it.
If they're going to get us excited, live up to expectation. Come on, Berry Bros. Right, well, I hope you enjoyed hearing from Jasper Morris, the Burgundy insider, or as we have agreed to call him, the Duke of Burgundy. This episode was just the warm-up. Next week, it gets very serious, and we are going to go through the wine regions from top to bottom. Jasper will be sharing his insights, letting us know where we can find the value, and equally, where he thinks are the most interesting Grand Crus right now. Well, as always, I will end this episode with a quote, and this one made me smile. Certainly, it's a perfect example of how special Burgundian wine can be. It's from Hilaire Belloc. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. He was a Franco-English writer, and he said, "I forget the name of the place. I forget the name of the girl, but the wine was Chambertin." People will always have a special place in their heart for Burgundies. So that is it for today. Don't forget to share this podcast with your wine-loving friends. If you can rate the podcast, leave a review, like it on your podcast app, please do. May you have a beautiful week with some delicious wine adventures, and I will see you back again next week for more Burgundy chat. Cheers to you.